The night has fallen over the medieval countryside, and with it, a deep hush spreads across the land. The battlefields of the day are behind us now, the shouts, the clashing steel, the desperate cries. In their place comes a quieter soundscape. The faint crackle of campfires, the low murmur of men speaking softly, the shuffle of boots as the last of the evening's tasks are finished. Imagine yourself stepping into this world. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth. Beyond the dim glow of the fire, the camp fades into darkness, only broken by the outline of tents and the silhouettes of watchmen who stand at their posts, silent and alert. The soldiers are tired, so very tired. Their bodies ache from long marches, from the weight of weapons carried since sunrise, from the tension of battle that lingers even when the swords are sheathed. They gather close to the flames, some still clutching a crust of bread or a cup of watered wine, others already stretching themselves out upon straw mats or rough cloaks laid over the hard ground, and there beside them lies the unmistakable presence of armor. Breastplates rest against wooden poles, helms sit upon overturned shields. The chainmail, still smelling faintly of sweat and iron, is carefully folded or sprawled in heavy heaps. These suits of steel and mail seem almost alive in the shifting firelight, like silent companions keeping watch through the night. Few men would ever attempt to sleep inside them. The burden of iron was too great, too unyielding, too cruel against the skin. And yet, as the warriors drift toward uneasy sleep, their armor remains close by, an ever-present reminder of tomorrow's dangers, and of the fragile barrier between rest and sudden battle. This is the silence of a medieval camp, heavy, watchful, filled with the quiet breath of men who know they must sleep, even as fear whispers that they should not. For many centuries, stories have painted knights and warriors in a particular light, in illuminated manuscripts, in poems sung by troubadours, and later in paintings and plays. These figures of the Middle Ages are often imagined as men who lived and breathed inside their armor. Gleaming in steel, they rode to war by day, and by night, they supposedly kept the same iron shell upon their bodies, as if it were not only protection, but their very identity. This is the romance of armor, the vision of the knight who never lays it aside, whose valor shines in polished steel, whose sleepless watch is carried out within the weight of iron. It is an image that endures. Even today, in films and tales that show knights dining at long tables or lying in bed still wrapped in their shining suits, but the reality was far different. Armor, though marvelously designed, was never meant to be a second skin through the long hours of rest. A full suit of chainmail or plate could weigh anywhere between 20 to 30 kilograms, or even more. The pressure on shoulders, the strain on the back, the way it dug into the flesh after a day of combat, these were not burdens a man would willingly carry once the fighting was done. Sleeping in armor was not only uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Blood flow could be restricted, joints stiffened, and sores opened where metal or leather pressed too tightly against the skin. Sweat soaked the padded garments beneath, leaving them heavy and damp, clinging to the body even after the armor was removed. To lie down with all that still upon you would mean a restless night at best, and serious injury or illness at worst. So the truth is this: when the stories told of knights resting within their armor, they were speaking more of symbol than reality. Armor symbolized readiness, vigilance, and eternal bravery. But in the camps, in the quiet moments after battle, armor was set aside, laid upon the ground, hung upon wooden frames, or placed within arm's reach for emergencies. It waited silently beside its owner until morning. The men themselves sought whatever comfort they could find. Straw pallets, woolen cloaks, sometimes only the bare earth, these became the beds of warriors. The armor was not their bedding, but their burden, worn only when absolutely needed. The romance of the knight in shining armor never truly matched the weary soldier's reality. What shimmered in poetry and legend became, in life, sweat, bruises, and relief at the chance to finally let the body breathe free of iron. The battlefield does not simply end when the fighting stops. For the men who carried swords, shields, and armor through the long hours of conflict, the true weight of war often arrived only after the silence fell. Imagine a warrior returning to camp at dusk. His body trembles, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of muscles pushed past their limits. The arms that swung a sword or raised a shield now ache with a dull, heavy throb. His legs stiff from hours of marching, bracing, and sudden bursts of movement feel as if they might give way beneath him. Even the fingers, curled too long around leather grips, are stiff and sore, reluctant to straighten. Wounds, some sharp and bloody, others hidden beneath the skin, add to the burden. A cut along the forearm may sting with each movement. A bruise, where the shield struck back against his chest, may spread darkly beneath the skin. Even when no fatal blow was struck, the armor itself left its mark. The weight of mail dragged upon shoulders, the straps of plate pressed into flesh, leaving red grooves across the body. The padded gambeson worn beneath the armor, though it softened the bite of steel, trapped sweat and heat. After a day's battle, it was damp, heavy, and suffocating against the skin. Removing it brought relief. Yet sometimes even the act of pulling it free reopened wounds or chafed raw places. Now, picture such a man trying to lie down to rest while still wearing his armor. The body longs to stretch, but the steel resists. The ribs strain for air, yet the chestplate confines. The pressure on joints and shoulders does not ease when he reclines, it only shifts, driving discomfort into new places. Sleep becomes a battle of its own, one the warrior cannot win. More than comfort was at stake. To remain in armor through the night meant risking illness. Circulation slowed, sweat cooled against the skin, and sores might fester. Infections were a constant shadow in the medieval world, where even a small wound could turn deadly. A soldier who denied his body rest and relief invited weakness into tomorrow's fight. So, when the fires burned low and the camp grew quiet, most men let the armor fall away. Piece by piece, they set aside the breastplate, the gauntlets, the helm. What remained was the weary, aching body of a man, flesh and bone, longing for the simple grace of rest. In that moment, stripped of steel, the warrior was not the invincible figure of legend, but a human being in need of healing. And it was in this state, more than in shining armor, that he faced the hardest truth of war, that tomorrow would come quickly, and his body must endure it once again. As the last glow of the sun fades from the horizon, the medieval encampment changes its rhythm. The noise of the datha, clash of arms, the bark of orders, the steady tramp of marching feet softens into a quieter, more uneven music. The first Notes come from the campfires. Flames crackle as logs shift, sending sparks into the cooling night air. Around these fires, small groups of men gather. Some speak in hushed tones, trading fragments of conversation, stories from home, or simple grumbles about sore feet and stale bread. Others fall into silence, staring into the embers, as if hoping the glow might warm more than their bodies. Further off, the sound of sharpening stones whispers through the camp, swords being drawn across whetstones in slow, patient strokes. The steady rhythm is almost like a lullaby, though its purpose is anything but gentle. These men know that tomorrow the blade must be ready again. Not far away, pots hang over low flames, carrying the earthy scent of barley stew or the faint salt of dried meat simmering back to life. The air itself is thick with many smells at once: smoke, iron, sweat, horse leather, and damp earth. It is a tapestry of scents that clings to everything, from cloaks to blankets, reminding each man where he is. As the night deepens, voices grow fewer. Some soldiers stretch out on straw mats or bare ground, using cloaks for pillows. Others sit leaning against their shields, letting fatigue pull them into uneasy slumber where they sit. Tents mark the difference of rank, larger ones for lords and knights, smaller or none at all for common men. And always, there is the watch. The soft crunch of boots on dirt marks the steps of sentries as they move along the camp's edges. They carry torches or lanterns, their eyes scanning the dark for movement. The safety of every sleeper depends upon these men who remain awake. Yet even with guards, there is no true peace. Sleep comes but lightly. The men know too well how quickly it can be broken, by the horn of alarm, by the sudden clamor of attack, by the cry of a comrade. They lie down beside their weapons, armor stacked within reach, hearts never entirely at rest. This is night in a medieval encampment, a place where exhaustion finally overtakes fear, but never erases it. A place where silence is fragile, broken easily by a cough, a restless dream, or the far-off howl of a wolf in the woods beyond. And in that uneasy quiet, men drift toward sleep, knowing that with the first light of dawn, the struggle will begin again. When the day's battles and marches came to an end, and the campfires burned low, the warrior at last could lay aside the burden of steel. To remove armor was not merely a practical task, it was a ritual of relief. Piece by piece, the weight was lessened, the helm lifted from the brow, the gauntlets slid from tired hands, the plates and mail eased away from sore shoulders, yet the armor was never abandoned. It remained close, always close, a silent sentinel at the warrior's side. For the common soldier, armor might be set upon the ground, his shield propped against it, his sword laid across the top as if to keep it all together. Chainmail, heavy and flexible, was often folded or gathered in heaps, its links clinking softly when moved. A breastplate or backplate might be laid flat upon the earth beside its owner, reflecting a faint shimmer of firelight. Knights and nobles, whose suits of plate were more elaborate, often entrusted their squires with the task. The armor would be carefully hung upon wooden racks or simple poles, piece by piece, to prevent dampness from seeping into the joints. Straps were loosened, buckles unfastened, edges wiped down with oil or cloth to guard against rust. In some cases, A padded gambeson was hung nearby to dry, the sweat of the day steaming faintly in the night air, wherever it was placed. The armor became a presence of its own within the camp. By the faint glow of embers, the curved surfaces of helms and breastplates seemed to watch, gleaming like quiet eyes in the dark. The men lay down beside them, not only from necessity, but from habit. For armor was too valuable, too vital, to be left beyond arm's reach. If danger came suddenly, in the night, there would be no time to search. Each warrior knew where his gear rested, every piece set down with care so it could be found in the half-light of panic. The sword's hilt might be left pointing toward the sleeping hand, the shield leaning just at the side of the bedroll. Thus, the armor kept vigil even while its master slept. It bore no dreams, no weariness, no fear. It was patient, waiting, holding within it the promise of battle yet to come. And though the men longed for rest, they could never truly forget that the steel beside them would soon be called upon again. In the stillness of the medieval camp, a warrior did not sleep alone. He lay with his comrades, with the sounds of night, and with the heavy, unspoken company of the armor at his side. Chainmail, or mail, was one of the most remarkable defenses of the medieval world. Thousands of tiny iron rings, each linked carefully with the next, formed a flexible fabric of metal. To the eye, it appeared as a glittering net of steel, draping over the body like cloth. To the hand, however, it was anything but light. A full hauberk, the long shirt of chainmail, that covered a man from shoulders to mid-thigh, might weigh as much as 10 to 15 kilograms. Add to this the coif, the hood of mail that encircled the head and neck, and the show's long leggings of linked rings for the legs. Piece by piece, the weight grew heavier, until the body carried what felt like a constant pull of the earth itself. At first, a strong man could bear it well. When moving, the weight was distributed, the mail shifting with the body's rhythm. But after hours through marches, through fighting, through the endless strain of lifting sword and shield, the burden became sharp and unforgiving. The shoulders carried the greatest share. Straps might help distribute the load, but still the rings pressed downward, biting into the flesh beneath. Even with a padded gambeson, bruises often bloomed along collarbones and upper arms. The spine, too, bent slightly forward beneath the constant drag, making the back ache by nightfall, nor did the weight rest evenly. The rings gathered at joints, pulling against elbows and knees. Every bend caused the mail to pinch or shift, rubbing against the skin through layers of cloth. Soldiers learned to live with the soreness, but it followed them into camp at day's end. Now imagine trying to lie down to sleep with such armor still upon you. The mail pressed uncomfortably into the ribs, its weight folding against the chest. The rings, once a flexible curtain, became a hard mat beneath the body. To roll onto one side meant new pressure points digging into hip or shoulder. Even breathing felt heavier, as though the chest carried not only the fatigue of battle, but the burden of iron still clinging to it. It was for this reason that few, if any, chose to keep mail on during the night. It was simply too much for a weary body already drained by the day. To remove it was to feel an almost indescribable relief, as if the weight of the world itself had been lifted. Shoulders straightened, lungs filled more freely, and the body could, at last, begin to heal. CHAINMAIL was protection, yes, but it was also pressure on, iron companion that never let the warrior forget the cost of safety. By day, it was his shield. By night, it was his burden, and one that he gladly set aside before surrendering himself to sleep. If chainmail was like a heavy curtain of iron, then plate armor was a cage. By the late Middle Ages, knights and wealthy warriors often exchanged their woven rings for great plates of steel, hammered and shaped to match the curves of the human body. At first glance, such armor seemed magnificent. Sunlight danced along polished breastplates, helms gleamed like silver, and the warrior within appeared less a man than a figure of legend. Paintings and tapestries later captured this brilliance, showing knights as shining statues astride their horses. But inside that cage, life was not so noble. A full suit of plate armor could weigh 20 to 25 kilograms or more, depending on its design. Though the clever work of armorers distributed the weight evenly, the effect on the body was still profound. Every movement had to push against steel, shoulders straining beneath pauldrons, knees bending stiffly within cuisses, fingers confined inside gauntlets of articulated iron, breastplates pressed firmly against the ribs and chest, narrowing the space for each breath. To inhale deeply felt as though the lungs pushed against walls that refused to yield. The helm, while protective, narrowed the warrior's world into a slit of light and a muffled echo of sound. Even voices, distant or near, reached the ear in muted tones. After hours of wearing it marching, fighting, or even standing watched, the body felt enclosed, restricted, and sore. Sweat gathered beneath the padded underclothing, soaking gambeson, and linen unable to escape through the unyielding steel shell. When the armor was finally removed, steam sometimes rose faintly from the damp fabric, as though the body itself had been trapped within a furnace. Now imagine the thought of sleeping in such a cage. To lie down in plate armor meant the steel pressed back into the body at every angle. The spine, unable to curve naturally, found no rest against the ground. The joints, already stiff, grew tighter still. Rolling onto one side was nearly impossible. To remain on the back meant the breastplate pushed down upon the chest, turning each breath into shallow gasps. For a man already weary from battle, the idea of rest within that cage was unthinkable. Armor was endurance by day, but it could not be borne through the night. The warrior who laid it aside felt not only relief, but freedom as though he had shed a prison. The clatter of each piece set down upon the earth was like a release, one sound after another, until, at last, he was simply himself again, a man, unarmored, exhausted, and desperate for sleep. Plate armor was a marvel, yes. It could turn aside arrows, blades, and blows that would have killed an unprotected man. But it also demanded a price, for to live inside it too long was to forget the simple ease of moving, breathing, or resting. By night, it stood beside its owner, silent and gleaming, waiting to reclaim him with the dawn. Of all the pieces of a knight's armor, none was so iconic or so stifling as the helmet. To see a warrior in full helm was to look upon a figure almost inhuman, a face of iron with eyes that gleamed only through narrow slits. In stories, the helmet gave an air of mystery and invincibility. But inside, it was a different matter. There were many kinds of helmets across the centuries. The simple nasal helm of the early Middle Ages, little more than a rounded cap with a strip of iron down the nose was light, offering protection without completely closing the head. But as weapons grew stronger, helms grew heavier. The great helm of the 13th century enclosed the head entirely, with only thin holes for vision and breath. Later visored bassinets and sallets balanced defense with a little more comfort, yet all shared the same truth. The helmet was a prison of steel for the senses. Breathing within one was never easy. The air grew hot and stale, trapped within the narrow chamber of iron. Each exhale echoed back to the wearer, moistening the interior, while each inhale seemed thinner, as if it passed through too small a gate. In battle, when the heart raced, and the lungs demanded more air, the sensation could become overwhelming. The warrior might gasp, pant, and feel the helm pressing tighter with every breath. Sound, too, was dulled. The cries of comrades, the clash of weapons, the commands of captains all reached the ear in muffled tones, warped by the curved walls of steel. Some warriors described the effect as fighting in a bell, each noise rebounding inside, a constant ringing around the head. And when the battle was done, the discomfort did not vanish. To wear such a helm into the night would have been unbearable. Imagine lying down with one strapped tight upon the brow, the weight pressing against temples, the metal edges biting into the skin. The air would only grow warmer as the body sought rest, until breathing itself felt like labor. No man could truly sleep under such strain. Instead, helmets were among the first pieces removed. Squires lifted them away from weary nights, wiping the sweat from brow and hair. Common soldiers unstrapped theirs with fumbling hands, letting the night air rush in cool and free. The relief was instant, like stepping out of a crowded, stifling room into the open sky. Laid upon the ground, or set carefully atop a shield, the helm rested beside its owner. In the faint light of the fire, its hollow face still seemed to watch, the camp-empty eyes staring outward into the dark. It was a reminder of battle, of danger, of the day yet to come. But for now, it was silent, and the man beneath it could finally breathe again. Beneath the gleaming plates and the heavy chainmail, there was always something softer, quieter, and far less celebrated. The warrior's true shield against pain was not only iron but cloth, thick, quilted padding known as the gambeson. A gambeson looked simple enough at first glance. It was a long coat, often reaching to the thighs, with sleeves that covered the arms, but unlike ordinary clothing, it was stuffed with layer after layer of linen, wool, or sometimes horsehair, stitched together in narrow quilted rows. When worn beneath armor, it acted as a cushion, absorbing the force of blows and preventing steel from grinding too cruelly against the flesh. Without it, a knight in chainmail would have been rubbed raw within hours. With it, he could fight longer, withstand more, endure more. In truth, the gambeson was as vital as the armor itself, yet this padded garment came with its own burdens. Imagine wearing such a coat through a long summer's day, thick layers pressing clothes against the skin, trapping every drop of sweat. The fabric grew heavy, clinging and damp. The odor of linen soaked in hours of labor stayed with the man, mingled with the metallic temps of iron and the dust of the road. When battle ended and the armor was removed, the gambeson often remained. To peel it away required time and energy. And for the exhausted soldier, it was sometimes easier to collapse where he was, still wrapped in its suffocating warmth. But comfort was scarce. The stitching that once cushioned now pressed awkwardly against the body as he lay on the ground. Damp cloth cooled quickly in the night air, chilling the skin beneath. Some gambesons doubled as outerwear for poorer soldiers, who could not afford a full suit of armor. For them, the padded coat was not only defense, but bed and blanket as well. They slept in it by necessity, even when it weighed heavy on their weary limbs. For nights, however, squires often hung the gambeson nearby, giving it a chance to dry by the fire. The fabric would stiffen as it cooled, holding the shape of the man who had worn it through the day. Though rarely mentioned in tales of glory, the gambeson was the unseen guardian, the secret layer beneath the steel. It bore the sweat, the dust, and the blood of countless days, and it was this humble garment, more than the shining armor above it, that determined whether a warrior could endure the endless cycle of march, battle, and restless sleep. For in the night, when the steel lay silent beside its master, the padded gambeson still clung to him like a second skin, soft, suffocating, and always close. To imagine sleeping in armor is to imagine surrendering the body to a prison of heat. Even when the campfires burned low and the night air grew cool, the soldier who lay down encased in steel carried with him the furnace of the day. With its thousands of interlinked rings, trapped the warmth of the flesh beneath. Each movement made the mesh shift and rasp, a ceaseless reminder of its weight. Beneath it, the gambeson clung, sodden with sweat, pressing damp linen against the skin. What had protected a man in battle became a swamp of fabric and iron when he sought rest. Plate armor was worse. The steel enclosed the body as tightly as a chest encloses its treasure, but with no space for breath to move freely. Heat gathered and had nowhere to go. The skin beneath prickled, then burned, as sweat coursed down in rivulets that could not dry. The man felt as if the very air was growing thinner, each inhale hotter than the last. Some nights spoke of a kind of suffocation, not from lack of oxygen, but from the constant press of confinement. The chest plate rose and fell with each breath, yet always resisted, as though the armor itself resented the body within it. To lie upon the ground while so bound was to feel the earth pressing from below, the iron pressing from above, and the lungs straining between the two. Sleep, if it came at all, was shallow and uneasy. The heat kept the mind restless, the weight kept the limbs pinned, and the stale air beneath the helmetor, even within the padded layers, left the body gasping for relief. More often than not, men would tear at their straps in the night, loosening belts, unlatching buckles, anything to free themselves enough to breathe again. And yet, even for those who managed to endure, there was no true rest. Every shift of the body made the armor grind against bone and muscle. Every attempt to find comfort only reminded the wearer that comfort did not exist within iron walls. By dawn, the man who had tried to sleep in armor awoke not refreshed, but more broken than before. This was why, despite the dangers of surprise attack, few ever chose to remain armored through the night. The heat, the sweat, the suffocation, it was a burden greater than the fear of an enemy's blade. A warrior's armor was more than a shell of steel. It was a constant weight, pressing day and night upon the places most fragile, the shoulders and the spine. From the moment the plates or chainmail were strapped into place, gravity began its quiet work. The mail shirt sagged downward, every iron ring tugging at the muscles of the neck and back. The padding beneath spread the load, but it could not erase it. Even the best-fitted armor left the shoulders aching after hours of march and fight. Plate, though cleverly designed, had its own punishments. The cuirass hugged the torso, but the pauldrons rested firmly upon the shoulders, bearing the weight of armed defenses and sometimes even part of the helmet's strain. Each step jarred the vertebrae, each swing of a sword pulled against the muscles that tried to hold the whole system in balance. For a time, an hour, perhaps two, a strong man might hardly notice. The adrenaline of combat could dull the pain, but when the sun sank low, when the fight was done, the ache would return in full. Shoulders throbbed as if struck by unseen blows. The spine stiffened, resisting even the smallest bend. Many nights ended their days hunched forward, burdened not just by years, but by the memory of armor's weight. To lie down while still wearing it was to invite torment. The rings of mail gathered beneath the shoulder blades, grinding bone against earth. The plates pressed awkwardly, forcing the back into unnatural shapes. The very act of reclining only increased the pressure, as if the body were caught between the unforgiving ground below and the unyielding steel above. Some chroniclers wrote of soldiers who tried to doze in armor during night watches, slumped against walls or trees. Their sleep was shallow, broken by jolts of pain as their necks bent too far or their shoulders screamed under the constant pull. By morning they rose stiff and slower, their movements dulled, their strength taxed. It was not cowardice that made a man shed his armor at night. It was survival. The spine could not endure the endless burden, nor the shoulders carry such weight beyond the hours of necessity. Rest demanded release. The armor had to come off, to be laid aside like a heavy memory, or the warrior himself would soon be broken. Thus, when night fell upon the camp, one of the first acts was always to shrug off the steel. The sigh of relief, the roll of the shoulders, the stretch of the back, these were as much a part of survival as the sword itself. And so, even in uneasy slumber, the body could at last remember what it was to be free of iron's grip. Armor was meant to protect, but protection came at a cost. The body beneath did not remain unmarked. Even the finest craftsmanship could not soften the ceaseless friction of metal against flesh. With every march, every strike, and every shift of stance, the armor rubbed. The gambeson, thick and padded, shielded the skin from sharp edges, but it also trapped heat and sweat. Damp cloth clung to the body, softening the skin until it blistered under the constant grind. By evening, the soldier's arms and torso carried the raw impressions of straps, the tender swelling of rubbed flesh, and the dull bloom of bruises. Mail left its own signature. The rings, pressed against the padding, imprinted their pattern into skin and muscle alike. A warrior who removed his hauberk after a day's wear often bore the ghost of it upon his body, as though the iron had branded him. Where straps crossed at the shoulders, the waist, the thighs, deep lines darkened into bruises, each one a silent reminder of hours under strain. Plate was no gentler. Though it spread weight across the body, its edges and joints shifted in battle. The inside seams scraped against collarbones, elbows, and hips. Knees bore the pressure of riveted joints. Ankles rubbed raw within armored shoes. Even the armpits, pressed against metal with every swing of a weapon, grew sore and inflamed, and where the body sweated most beneath the arms, along the thighs, At the small of the back, salt and dampness turned irritation into wounds. Sores blossomed in hidden places, stubborn and painful, slow to heal. Infection, in an age without antibiotics, lurked in every open cut. To sleep in armor was to worsen all of this. The body, unable to shift freely, could not ease the rubbing or find relief. Each turn on the ground dug the bruises deeper, scraped the sores anew, and pressed the chafing straps more cruelly against the skin. What little rest the soldier found came wrapped in discomfort, and by dawn he was more weary than when he had laid down. Thus the choice was clear. A warrior stripped away his armor not only for freedom of breath and movement, but for mercy upon his own skin. To lay down bare of steel was to give the flesh a chance to breathe, to dry, and to heal, if only for a few short hours before the weight returned again. To the eye of a poet, a knight in gleaming steel seemed untouchable, a figure forged of iron rather than flesh. Yet beneath that polished surface lay a body vulnerable in ways most never saw. For armor was not only heavy, it was stifling. It turned the human frame into a chamber of heat and dampness, where illness took root in silence. The padding beneath the gambeson was thick with layers of quilted cloth. By the end of a day's march or battle, it was soaked through not only with sweat, but sometimes with blood, rain, or mud ground deep into its seams. Few warriors had the luxury of spare garments. Washing was rare. A gambeson worn day after day became a breeding ground for rashes, sores, and unseen fevers. The body trapped inside had little chance to breathe. Sweat pooled in the folds of the cloth, skin softened and broke. The smallest cut could sour into infection, a blister into an ulcer. In an age before antibiotics, such wounds were far more dangerous than the blade of the enemy. A fever could rise from a scratch left to fester under damp linen. A cough could deepen into illness when the chest never dried from the weight of wet cloth and steel. Some soldiers, pressed by fear of attack, slept in their armor regardless. Yet this choice brought its own hazard. Night offered no escape from the suffocating damp, no chance for the body to dry or heal. The longer the armor stayed on, the greater the risk. A knight who braved the night fully armed might rise not only sore and weary, but sickening, his strength slipping away long before the next battle began. Chroniclers tell us of men who fell not from the sword, but from the slow decay of their own bodies, brought low by infection, fever, and exhaustion worsened by iron's embrace. The armor that was meant to preserve them could, when worn too long, become an accomplice to their decline, and so, even in the most perilous of times, the wise warrior risked undressing. To strip away the steel was to risk surprise, yes, but it was also to choose life over slow illness. For no man, however brave, could fight long when his very flesh had turned against him. Armor was a second body, one that never forgot its weight. For every step a warrior took, the joints bore its burden. Shoulders carried the drag of chain, hips supported the hang of plates, knees bent beneath the steady pull of greaves. Each movement, simple and ordinary, became a negotiation between flesh and iron. In battle, adrenaline made the burden easier to ignore. A man swung his sword, raised his shield, and felt himself carried forward by urgency. But when the shouting faded and the night grew still, the strain returned, no longer masked by the rush of blood. Muscles trembled from their labor. Joints ached, as though the iron had ground their very sockets into the earth. The knees, in particular, suffered. Mail and plate forced them into constant compromise, never fully free, never entirely at rest. To kneel was to press bone against metal. To rise was to heave weight from below. Ankles to felt the ceaseless pinch, the armored shoes resisting. The natural bend of the foot. The shoulders fared little better. The act of bearing a hauberk left them swollen and weary, as though pressed downward by unseen hands. Even after the mail was stripped away, the ghost of it remained, the dull ache of joints pulled low, the soreness that no shifting on a mat of straw could ease. To attempt sleep in armor was to trap the body in this pain. Muscles could not stretch freely, joints could not relax. Every posture carried pressure somewhere on the hips, the knees, the neck, the back. What little rest the warrior found was broken by the body's protests, each groan of strained sinew pulling him back toward waking thus. By dawn, a man who had not removed his armor was no stronger than before. He rose stiff and slow, his body heavy with fatigue, his movements dulled by the stiffness of the night. The enemy's steel was a danger, yes, but so too was the slow erosion of his own strength. For no warrior could endure long when his very joints and muscles had been made prisoners of iron. The body is a living thing of rhythm, lungs drawing and releasing breath, blood coursing through its unseen rivers. Yet once sealed within armor, that rhythm faltered. Iron did not crush the warrior outright, but it pressed in quiet, unyielding ways, slowing the flow of life within him. Mail, draped in its heavy curtain, pressed down on the shoulders and chest. Over hours, the rings dug into the padding and the padding into the flesh, narrowing the freedom of breath. Each inhalation came shallower than the last, as though the air were thinner, more reluctant to enter. In battle, the pounding heart demanded more, yet the body found itself bound, its chest restricted, its breath shortened. Plate, with its fitted curves, offered protection at a different cost. The breastplate, tight and firm, turned the chest into a locked cage. To breathe deeply was to strain against it. Warriors often learned to live on shorter breaths, sips of air rather than gulps, adapting to the limits of their steel prison. Over time, this shallow breathing brought its own fatigue. A weariness born not of battle but of suffocation stretched across hours. Circulation, too, suffered beneath the harness. Straps cinched at the thighs and waist slowed the passage of blood. The legs, bound within cuisses and greaves, grew heavy and numb. To kneel too long was to risk tingling weakness, as if the very limbs were forgetting their purpose. The gauntlets, tight at the wrists, pressed upon veins until fingers stiffened and ached. At night, if a man dared lie down in such confinement, the body protested. Limbs swelled in their bindings. Breath came shallow. The weight upon the chest grew heavier with each attempt at sleep. The heart worked harder, but the air and blood it sought to move were never quite enough. Thus, even without a single wound, a warrior could wake weaker than he had lain down. His body strained by the simple act of existing too long within armor. For all its power to turn aside a blade, steel could not nourish life. The body beneath longed always for air, free, deep, and unbounded, something armor could never grant. When the last embers of battle faded, a different rhythm filled the camp. It was not silence exactly, but a gentler chorus, woven of weary men laying down the burdens of the day. The first sound was always the clatter of steel. Buckles undone, straps loosened, plates and rings falling into piles beside tired bodies. The voices of squires, low and steady, guided the work-soft instructions, the scrape of leather against rivets, the sigh of mail sliding free from aching shoulders. Then came the quieter labors. Boots tugged from swollen feet. Gambesons peeled away with effort, wounds checked in the dim firelight. A hiss of breath might escape a man as cloth pulled against a fresh bruise. Another might let out a groan as his knees finally bent without weight. Each noise was small, but together they formed the soundtrack of exhaustion. Beyond the circle of armor and firelight, the camp stirred with its own lullaby. Horses shifted in their tethers, stamping hooves against the earth. The smell of hay mingled with smoke. Someone sharpened a blade one last time, the rasp of stone on steel echoing faintly before being tucked away for morning. Laughter sometimes flickered in the darkness rough. Short bursts as men shared a jest to drive away the heaviness of thought. Other voices murmured in prayer, whispering thanks for survival or petitions for strength yet to come. A cough here, a snore there, the rustle of straw beneath a blanket. By degrees, the sounds softened. The clamor of the day gave way to the gentle crackle of fire, the sigh of a breeze moving through canvas and grass, the steady breathing of men who, at last, had yielded to sleep. And so the camp rested, not in silence but in a symphony of small, human sounds, each one a reminder that beneath the armor and beyond the battles, these were men of flesh and breath, as vulnerable and mortal as the listeners who dream of them now. Not all men lay down to rest in the same way. The battlefield bound noble and commoner together under one banner. But when the night descended, their places of rest revealed the distance between them. For the noble, a tent rose like a small fortress. Against the dark, its canvas walls caught the glow of torchlight. Its interior softened with carpets and cushions carried along by servants. Here, a bed if not of wood, then at least a frame of rope or furs lifted the body above the damp earth. Within, armor was set carefully upon stands, polished and waiting, as though the knight might step into it at dawn without effort. The air was rich with the scent of wax, wine, and perfumed oils, comforts born from wealth, even in the heart of war. For the common soldier, rest was of another kind. There were no walls of canvas, only the open sky, or at best, a rough lean-to fashioned from cloaks and branches. The ground itself was his bed, softened by straw if fortune allowed, by mud if not. Armor lay beside him in simple piles, cared for with what attention a weary body could muster, but never polished to a mirror shine. His rest was the rest of survival. A blanket, a crust of bread, the warmth of comrades pressed shoulder to shoulder. For heat between these two worlds, the night passed differently. In the noble's tent, a candle might burn long into the hours, the knight speaking in hushed tones with his squire or writing by flickering light. Plans for tomorrow whispered over parchment. Outside, meanwhile, common men curled into themselves, lulled not by comfort but by exhaustion, their dreams broken by the cold bite of the ground beneath their bones. And yet, in the deep of night, a curious sameness emerged. Whether on furs or bare earth, all men carried the same weariness in their limbs, the same ache in their joints, the same silent prayers for dawn. The noble's silken pillow and the soldier's patch of dirt could not change the truth that sleep, fragile and fleeting, was the only armor the body longed for in the hours between battles. In the quiet hours, when the last echoes of the day had faded, the work of servants and squires began in earnest. For a knight, the transition from war to rest was not a solitary act, but a ritual carried out by hands younger, humbler, and often overlooked in the telling of history. The squire's duty was both practical and intimate. Piece by piece, he eased the weight of armor from his master's body. Greaves unbuckled, gauntlets slid free, mail lifted carefully from weary shoulders. It was a slow undoing of the day's burdens. Each buckle loosed was like a sigh released, the knight's form shrinking back from the towering figure of steel he had been only hours before, by the light of a lantern or fire. Servants wiped the sweat and grime from steel oiling joints to keep them supple for the morrow. To leave armor untended, even for a night, was to risk rust or failure in the next clash. Thus, while the knight rested, others worked quietly, tending both man and metal. The care extended beyond armor. A squire brought water for washing, cloth for wounds, perhaps warmed wine to ease the stiffness of battle-worn muscles. Cloaks were spread, bedding arranged, a sword laid within reach should danger come in the dark. The knight's body might ache, his spirit weary, but through the diligence of others he was carried gently toward rest. For the servants themselves, there was no luxury of deep sleep. Their rest came in fragments, moments, stolen after their master was settled, before the dawn's labors called them again. Yet their role was essential, for in the order of the medieval camp, the knight's strength on the field was bound to the unseen hands that prepared him each night for the fragile gift of sleep. And so, beneath the starlit canvas of the camp, there existed a ritual of care, one man laying down his armor, another ensuring it would rise with him again at daybreak. In this quiet exchange, steel and flesh alike were made ready for whatever the morning might demand. As the camp settled into night, three things remained: the warmth of fire, the taste of food, and the vigilance of men who would not sleep. The fires burned low, their smoke curling into the night sky, carrying with it the scent of wood and ash. Around them, men huddled close, chasing away the damp air and the chill of earth beneath their cloaks. For some, the fire was a place of comfort, a final gathering before silence, where stories flickered alongside the flames. For others, it was a reminder of fragility, how a single spark of light might betray their presence to wandering eyes in the dark. Food, too, was part of the ritual. Bread torn by hand, meat simmered in pots, broth ladled into wooden bowls. The meals were simple, yet to the weary body they were treasures. Warmth for the belly, strength for the marrow. For the common soldier, this might be his only comfort, or coarse loaf, shared with comrades. For nobles, servants prepared richer fare within their tents, though even the finest feast could not entirely banish the taste of dust and smoke that lingered on every bite in the field. And then came the final watches, long after laughter faded, and the last embers sank into ash. Some remained awake. The watchmen paced the edges of the camp, their silhouettes dark against the dim light of moon or torch. Eyes scanned the horizon, ears strained for the crack of a twig, the rustle of movement beyond the firelight. While others slept uneasily, it was these men who bore the weight of vigilance. knowing that even in the stillness of night, danger might stir. Thus, the medieval camp rested in layers, the warmth of fire, the nourishment of food, the uneasy peace of those who trusted their comrades to keep watch. Together, these three pillars held back the vast, uncertain dark, till the dawn's first light called them once more to rise. When the campfire dimmed and silence spread, men turned to the places where their weary bodies would fall. Sleep in a medieval encampment was seldom solitary, seldom luxurious. It was a matter of endurance, of making do with what could be carried or found. For the common soldier, the bed was often no more than a mat of straw laid upon bare earth. The straw was coarse and brittle, sometimes softened by cloaks or sacks, but just as often filled with pests that nipped and crawled through the night. Blankets, if they had them, were rough woolen things, heavy with damp, shared between comrades huddling for warmth against the chill. Many slept shoulder to shoulder, pressed close as much out of necessity as fellowship. Their bed was not chosen, but endured. Nobles, by contrast, slept differently, though even their comforts were modest by modern measure. Within canvas tents, squires spread rugs and furs, layering them until the ground seemed less hostile. A frame of wood or rope might be set up, strung with hides, raising their master above the damp soil. Blankets were thicker, cloaks richer, and when fortune allowed, silks or feather-stuffed cushions softened the night. Yet even here, luxury was relative. The air was still cold, the earth still close, and the distant noises of camp and watch pressed through the canvas walls. Shared beds were not uncommon, even among the higher ranks. Companions, squires, or servants sometimes lay close, both for warmth and protection. The body of another man was as sure a shield against the cold as any blanket, and so intimacy grew not from choice but from survival. In winter marches, entire bands of men might sleep tangled together like one great living mass, their breath rising in clouds into the frosty air, though the forms differed. Straw for some, furs for others, rough wool or fine cloth. The truth was the same. Comfort was rare, and sleep was fragile. The soldier's bed was always temporary, always ready to be abandoned at the sound of the horn or the cry of alarm. What mattered was not softness but rest enough to rise again, armor waiting before the next dawn. In a world without fences strong enough to hold an army safe, the night itself became an enemy. Darkness cloaked both friend and foe, and so in every camp, sleep was divided, portioned out in careful turns. Not everyone slept at once, for to do so was to invite disaster. The camp was never fully silent. Even when the fires sank low and the murmur of men gave way to the stillness of night, there were always footsteps in the dark. Watchmen paced the perimeter, halting to listen, eyes straining toward the tree line or the curve of the hill. At intervals, men were roused from slumber, nudged awake to take their turn with spear or bow in hand, trading warmth for vigilance. For the common soldier, the night watch was both a burden and a duty. Exhausted though he might be, he could not refuse his hour on the line. Standing guard in the cold, wrapped in a cloak too thin for the wind, he felt the loneliness of the night in his bones. Yet he bore it, knowing his comrades slept because he did not. Knights, too, relied on this rotation. While nobles might rest more comfortably, their safety depended upon the waking eyes of others. A squire might sit near his master's tent, sword ready, ears tuned to the slightest disturbance. Trusted men of arms formed the closer ring, their presence both symbolic and practua, shield of living bodies between their lord and the dangers beyond the firelight. The system was imperfect, fragile, and sometimes deadly. A watchman's drowsy head, a moment's lapse in attention, could mean surprise at dawn or worse, slaughter in the dark. To stay awake while others slept required discipline, courage, and no small measure of fear. Thus the medieval night was a balance, half the camp dreaming uneasily, half the camp holding back the shadows. Together they endured the long hours, waiting for the horizon to pale, when the burden of wakefulness could at last be set down and the day's trials would begin anew. Sleep in a medieval camp was never whole. Even when the body longed for rest, the mind remained tethered to fear. Every warrior knew that night was not only a time for slumber but also a time of peril. The dark gave cover to enemies who crept silently, and many a battle was decided not in the clash of open daylight, but in the sudden chaos of a midnight strike. The fear was not unfounded. Raiders and rival armies alike prized the element of surprise. A camp, half asleep and unarmored, was as vulnerable as a nest torn open. A few torches thrown, a sudden cry in the dark, and order collapsed into panic. Horses whinnied in terror, tents caught fire, and men stumbled barefoot into the night, clutching for weapons they could not see, because of this ever-present danger. Soldiers seldom surrendered fully to slumber. Sleep was light, restless, broken by sudden jerks, awake at the sound of a snapping twig or the distant howl of a wolf, mistaken for a war cry. Armor, though too heavy to wear through the night, was kept close laid at a man's side, strapped where it could be seized quickly. Weapons were nearer still, often clutched like talismans in tired hands. For nobles, the fear was greater still, for their capture or death could unmake an entire army's cause. Their tents, though richer, were often guarded by rings of men, yet even inside canvas walls, the sense of safety was thin. A knight or lord might close his eyes, but his dreams were never free from the thought that, at any moment, the world outside could erupt in flame and steel. Thus the medieval night was not gentle. It was an uneasy truce between exhaustion and fear, where every soldier slept with one ear open, waiting for the horn, the scream, or the clash of arms that might drag him from slumber into battle before the moon had set. If a soldier could not sleep in armor, he at least slept beside it. The iron shell that slowed his movements by day became a sentinel at night, laid carefully within reach. A reminder that danger was never far, armor was not discarded casually. Each piece had its place in the ritual of undressing at day's end. A knight might set his helmet near his head, his sword by his hand, the breastplate folded neatly at arm's length. Common men, with less equipment, did the same, mail shirts heaped beside cloaks, shields propped against makeshift bedding. The arrangement was deliberate. Armor had to be seized in an instant. Squires and servants played an important role in this nightly routine. For their lords, they laid out gear in a precise order, ensuring that should the alarm sound, each strap and buckle could be fastened quickly. A trained squire could dress a knight in minutes by moonlight, hands working swiftly over practiced ties. Even among common soldiers, comrades lent one another aid in fastening mail or lifting heavy plates when haste was needed. But readiness had its limits. No man could spring fully armored into battle in the heartbeat of a night raid. At best, he could grasp shield and blade, or throw a helmet over tangled hair, fighting half-dressed until time allowed for more. Many battles turned in those frantic moments when men stumbled to the line wearing only fragments of their defense, relying on courage and confusion as much as steel. Armor then was both comfort and burden in the night. Its presence was a promise of safety, but also a silent weight on the mind. Even when laid aside, it pressed upon the soldier's dreams, reminding him that peace was fragile, and that the thin thread of sleep could be snapped at any moment by the call to arms. For many warriors, the sword was not just a tool of war, but a constant companion, so constant, in fact, that it sometimes followed them into sleep. In camps where danger pressed close, men would rest with their blades at arm's length, or even beneath their heads, tucked under straw and blanket, as though the weapon itself were a pillow. This habit was both practical and symbolic. A sword beneath the pillow meant the warrior could seize it in a heartbeat, should the alarm sound or an enemy slip silently into camp. Unlike armor, which required time and effort to don, a weapon could be grasped instantly, its edge ready even in the confusion of darkness. For the common soldier, this meant a dagger or short blade within reach. For the knight, it was often the longsword, lying flat along the bedding, the hilt within easy grasp. Yet there was more than readiness in this ritual. To sleep with a weapon so close was also to acknowledge trust in Itha's sword as guardian, as comfort against the vulnerabilities of sleep. For some, it became a charm against fear, the cold steel beneath their pillow, a silent reassurance that they were never defenseless, even when dreaming. But this intimacy came with risk. Many tales, half warnings, half jests told of men who gashed themselves in restless sleep, or woke bloodied by the very tool meant to protect them. For this reason, some captains forbade the practice, insisting weapons be kept at hand, but not in bed. Still, countless soldiers defied the rule, unwilling to place even a few feet between themselves and their only lifeline in the event of a night raid. Thus, the sword under the pillow was more than superstition. It was the soldier's last tether to survival, a small defiance of the vulnerability that came with closing one's eyes. In the silence of the medieval night, when the campfires burned low and shadows stretched long, many a man's dreams were guarded by the cold, steady presence of the steel lying hidden beneath his head. While soldiers lay sprawled on straw or nobles reclined in canvas shelters, the thread that bound their sleep to survival was often just one man, the guard at the tent entrance. His presence was both practical necessity and silent reassurance, a living wall against the dangers of the night. For common soldiers, the guard was often a comrade, chosen by rotation, who sat awake while others slept. But for knights and nobles, the guard was far more deliberate, a trusted retainer, a loyal man-at-arms, or a seasoned veteran whose eyes were less likely to close against fatigue. This man did not merely watch the camp's edges. He kept vigil at the very threshold of his master's rest. The job was heavy with responsibility. To sleep while on watch was one of the gravest offenses, punished harshly, for it placed not just one life at risk but an entire company's. In the hush of the midnight hours, the guard would listen for every rustle of leaves, every creak of leather, every distant sound that might mask an approaching enemy, the flutter of the tent flap, the hiss of a shifting breeze, these were his constant companions. But his duty was more than defense. He was also the first line of awakening. Should danger arise, it was he who shouted the alarm, roused the sleeping, and bought precious seconds for armor to be buckled and weapons seized. In those moments, the difference between a vigilant guard and a drowsy one could decide whether a lord awoke to fight, or never awoke at all. The presence of a guard at the tent entrance also carried a quiet intimacy. Warriors placed their trust, and sometimes their very lives, in the wakefulness of one man. To sleep at ease, however lightly, a knight needed not just armor or sword, but faith in the loyalty and alertness of the figure seated in shadow at the canvas door. Thus, while history remembers the clashing of armies and the gleam of armor at dawn, the fragile safety of countless nights rested on a quieter image, one weary figure keeping watch by starlight, a hand on spear or sword, holding back the darkness while others dreamed. To understand the restless nights of warriors, one must first step into the world of medieval sleep itself, a rhythm far different from our own. Medieval men and women, whether peasant, monk, or knight, rarely slept in the long, uninterrupted stretches that modern people take for granted. Instead, their rest often came in two distinct phases, shaped by the slow swing of the seasons, the absence of artificial light, and the demands of work and watchfulness. Historians call this segmented sleep. After the day's labors, people retired shortly after nightfall, rising again in the middle of the night after a few hours of rest. This first sleep ended naturally, sometimes around midnight, when individuals might pray, talk quietly, or even tend small tasks by the dim glow of embers. Then would come the second sleep, stretching until dawn. This pattern seems strange to modern minds, but it suited a world lit only by firelight and guided by the rhythm of the sun. The total hours of rest varied. In winter, when darkness was long, people might enjoy 9 or more hours of sleep broken into segments. In summer, when daylight lingered, the night was shorter, and sleep often shrank to 6 or 7 hours, sometimes less for those bound to farm work or war. Nobles with soft beds and servants fared better than peasants on hard floors. But even kings were not immune to interrupted rest. For soldiers, however, even segmented sleep was a fragile luxury. On campaign, danger could cut the night short at any moment. Watch rotations, sudden alarms, the din of marching armies, these shattered the natural rhythms of rest. A warrior might scrape together 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, if fortune allowed, though many survived on far less. Exhaustion was a constant companion, and the body was forced to adapt, catching slumber whenever and wherever it could by the fire, in the saddle, or against a shield. Thus, when we imagine the medieval warrior refusing to sleep in armor, we must remember that he was already starved of rest. His decision was not merely about comfort, but about survival. To surrender what little sleep he could claim was to invite collapse when dawn brought battle again. In the medieval world, the night was not a single, unbroken darkness, but a rhythm divided into 2 distinct rests. Where modern people imagine a long stretch of sleep from evening until morning, the men and women of the Middle Ages often knew a very different pattern: first sleep and second sleep. The first sleep began soon after sunset, When the hearth burned low and candles were costly, villagers would crawl beneath rough wool blankets, while nobles drew heavy curtains round their beds to keep in warmth. After 3 or 4 hours, however, many naturally stirred awake. This was not considered strange. It was, in fact, expected. Between the first and second sleep lay a time of quiet wakefulness, sometimes lasting an hour or more. Families might whisper in the darkness. Couples shared intimacy. Monks rose to chant their midnight prayers, and solitary souls might step outside to gaze at the stars or tend a smoldering fire. In cities, this was the hour of thieves and night watchmen. In villages, it was when farmers checked on animals or prayed for safe passage through the long night. Then came the second sleep. Bodies still heavy with weariness sank once more into rest until dawn's light or the first crow of the rooster. This phase was often deeper, filled with vivid dreams. Medieval dream books, many preserved by monks, reveal how seriously people took these nighttime visions, reading them as omens or divine whispers. But for warriors in the field, segmented sleep was rarely so calm. The first sleep might be cut short by the bark of a watchman or the alarm of a horn. The waking hour between sleeps was often filled not with prayer, but with dread checking weapons, listening for enemy movement, or calming the gnawing thought that death might come before morning. Many soldiers never reached a second sleep at all, robbed of that deeper rest by fear or sudden attack. Thus, segmented sleep tells us much about medieval life, that rest was fragile, easily broken, and deeply tied to the rhythms of darkness. It also reminds us why warriors valued even a brief moment of true slumber, stripped of armor and the burden of iron. For in a world where the night itself was divided, sleep was never guaranteed. For the medieval mind, a dream was never just a dream. To close one's eyes and see strange visions in sleep was to brush against the realm of the divine or the demonic. Dreams were whispers from beyond, warnings, promises, or riddles that demanded interpretation. And for warriors, who slept with death close at hand, such visions could weigh as heavily as any sword or shield. Many soldiers carried deep superstitions into their restless nights. A dream of falling was dreaded, believed to foretell disaster in battle. To dream of broken weapons was thought to mean defeat or betrayal. Conversely, dreams of light, flowing water, or victory feasts gave heart to weary men, seen as blessings from God or signs of triumph yet to come. These beliefs were not born in isolation. The Middle Ages inherited dream lore from both Christian and classical traditions. The Bible itself was filled with men who dreamed Jacob's ladder, Joseph's visions, the warnings of angels. Ancient texts circulating in monasteries also preserved dream manuals, cataloging images and their meanings. It was not unusual for knights or squires, upon waking troubled, to seek out a priest, monk, or wise man to help explain what their night had revealed. In the encampments of war, such interpretations carried weight. A captain who dreamed of blood might delay an attack. A soldier who dreamed of fire might whisper of ambush to his comrades. Though strategy and steel determined the outcomes of battles, superstition often guided the choices that led to them. Yet dreams could also torment. The horrors of battle replayed themselves in the minds of men, twisted into nightmares. To the medieval warrior, these too were omens, sometimes of damnation, sometimes of a restless soul haunted by sins unconfessed, for men steeped in faith. The line between dream, omen, and divine warning was thin, and every vision was freighted with meaning. Thus, when the warrior closed his eyes in the fragile hours between watch and dawn, he did not simply rest. He entered a world where the mind's theater was believed to echo heaven or hell. In such a world, a single dream could stiffen the courage of an army or unravel it. When the campfire embers sank low and the voices of comrades dwindled to silence, many warriors turned to prayer. In the tense hours between first and second sleep, men sought the shield of faith more than the shield of iron, for in the medieval world, the night was not only a time of rest, but also a time of danger, physical, spiritual, and unseen. Knights, bound by oaths of chivalry, often whispered prayers before lying down. They recited the Pater Noster or invoked the Virgin Mary, asking for safe passage through the night. Some made the sign of the cross over their bedding, or kissed a small crucifix hung around their neck. In certain orders, like the Templars, communal prayers at fixed hours, matins or lauds, meant that the silence of the night was broken by low chants rising from the tents of pious men. Among common soldiers, prayers were more personal and often mingled with superstition. Some muttered charms against nightmares. Others carried small relics or amulets, a saint's medal, a blessed token, or even a scrap of scripture tucked into a pouch. These were not merely tokens of faith, but shields against the terrors of both body and soul. Rituals varied. A man might wash his hands and face with water before lying down, cleansing himself as monks did before prayer. Another might touch his weapon, whispering a vow to God that he would fight with honor if granted another dawn. The most fearful lay with their rosary coiled in their palm, drifting into dreams while their fingers traced the beads. To the medieval warrior, midnight was a liminal hour. Darkness was thought to be the realm of demons, of restless spirits, of the devil himself. To sleep unguarded, without prayer, was to risk not only death by sword, but corruption of the soul. And so the camp became a strange blend of silence and devotion, with whispers of holy words drifting in the same air that carried the crackle of fires and the distant murmur of watchmen. In the fragile darkness, faith was the last armor, and if sleep finally came, it came as a mercy believed to be granted not by chance, but by God. Not every night in a medieval encampment was ruled by silence, dread, or prayer. In the quiet hours before exhaustion claimed them, soldiers often turned to the oldest companions of humankind, music and story. These small rituals of camaraderie softened the edges of fear, bringing moments of laughter, memory, and comfort to men far from home. Around the embers of campfires, rough voices lifted in song. Some were martial chants, meant to strengthen courage and bind men together with rhythm and refrain. Others were ballads of love and loss, sung in low tones that carried through the still night air. A knight might hum a troubadour's melody from a distant court, while common soldiers repeated the folk songs of their village's simple verses that spoke of harvest, sweethearts, or the turning of the seasons. Stories, too, were passed around. Like shared bread, veterans told tales of past campaigns, sometimes grim, sometimes embroidered with humor. Myths and legends wandered through the night, of heroes who fought giants, of saints who worked miracles, of kings who rose and fell. 2 young squires and fresh recruits, These stories were more than entertainment, they were lessons, warnings, and encouragement in such moments. The hard iron world of war softened into something almost homelike. The crackle of fire and the drone of a lute or flute when a musician was among them carried through the tents. Men leaned on each other's shoulders, laughing or weeping, finding solace in voices raised together. Even commanders recognized the value of these gatherings, for a comforted army was a steadier one. Of course, not all captains approved. Some viewed music as frivolity, fearing noise might betray their position. Yet even then, whispers of story, or the quiet hum of a lullaby could still be heard in the shadows. A reminder that men carried not only swords but also songs into battle. For many warriors, these were the gentlest hours of the night, the only time when the camp felt less like a place of fear and more like a wandering village. In the end, these songs and stories were as much a defense as armor, not against blades or arrows, but against despair. Most warriors avoided sleeping in armor whenever possible. Yet there were times when necessity outweighed comfort, and sieges were among the harshest of these. Unlike open field battles, which ended in a day, sieges dragged on for weeks, months, even years. Within the shadow of castle walls, the fear of sudden attack never lifted, and soldiers often found themselves half-armored, day and night, a besieging army camped in dangerous ground. They lived within bowshot of defenders who rained arrows, stones, and fire from above. Siege engines groaned at all hours, towers and ladders were prepared in secrecy, and tunneling operations, sappers digging beneath walls, meant surprise assaults could erupt at any moment. In such tension, soldiers often kept on parts of their armor, especially helmets, breastplates, or mail shirts while they rested. Inside besieged castles, conditions were even more desperate. Men on the walls had no luxury of stripping down fully. Archers might doze with helmets tilted back, swords across their laps. Guards slept in short shifts, sometimes with armor half buckled, for fear that the enemy would breach the gates. In the dark, the creak of ropes, the crash of stones, the sudden flare of fire aerosol could rouse an army in seconds. The toll on the body was immense. Armor chafed raw skin, pressed heavy on weary muscles, and turned restless nights into agony. Sweat and filth bred rashes and infection. Yet many endured it, because to be caught unready in a siege was to risk death not only for oneself, but for the entire garrison. Chroniclers noted that during long sieges, men often smelled of rust, leather, and unwashed flesh. Their bedding was damp with sweat and rain, their armor pitted from constant wear. Some became so used to the weight that when finally freed, they staggered like men learning to walk anew. Sieges were the rare times when warriors truly did live in armor, and though these ordeals showed endurance and discipline, they also revealed the human cost. A life where even sleep, the last refuge of the weary, was invaded by the iron cage of war. If sieges chained men to one place, forced marches did the opposite, dragging armies across unforgiving miles with little pause for rest. For knights and foot soldiers alike, these were among the most brutal ordeals of medieval campaigning. A forced march was exactly what the name implied. Movement without respite, driven by urgency. Perhaps reinforcements were needed before a battle, or a retreat had to be made under cover of night. Sometimes an enemy outflanked an army, and the only salvation was speed. Whatever the cause, soldiers marched until their legs trembled and their lungs burned, and then marched still further. Armor made this trial all the heavier. Even when not fully worn, mail shirts and breastplates had to be carried, often along with weapons, shields, and supplies. Knights might ride, but even horseback was no easy refuge. Horses grew tired. Saddles chafed, and riders slept fitfully in the saddle, slumping forward only to be jolted awake. Sleep, when it came, was stolen in fragments, a brief rest at a roadside, a drowsy collapse against a tree, or an hour's slumber on bare earth while comrades stood guard. Chroniclers tell of men marching half asleep, eyes glazed, feet dragging automatically, as if the body moved by habit alone, for knights who were expected to arrive ready for combat even after such grueling travel. The strain was immense. Muscles stiffened from lack of true rest, and armor felt doubly heavy when donned again after sleepless nights. The clash of battle after a forced march often saw men fighting not only their foes, but their own exhaustion. Yet forced marches were sometimes the difference between victory and ruin. The chronicles of medieval warfare are full of tales where the army that endured sleepless nights gained the advantage of position at dawn. For commanders, fatigue was a weapon as much as a sword wielded, not against the enemy, but against their own men, in the gamble that they would arrive in time for the common soldier. However, the memory of these marches was not of glory, but of aching legs, hollow eyes, and the desperate wish for a bed of straw, no matter how rough. In those hours, even armor set aside felt like a phantom weight, dragging down dreams that never quite came. If summer brought sweat and suffocation, winter brought another enemy, the bite of iron in the cold. Sleeping in armor during winter was not only uncomfortable but could be downright dangerous, turning protection into punishment. Metal does not warm with the body. A breastplate chilled in frosty air became like ice against the skin. Chainmail, with its thousands of tiny links, trapped the night's cold in every ring, radiating chill into the padding beneath. Helmets frosted on the inside, breath condensing against cold steel until it froze, leaving warriors waking to a thin sheen of rime where their lips had been. The gambeson, that thick quilted underlayer, helped somewhat, insulating the body from the worst of the cold. But once dampened by sweat or snow, it became a clammy sponge that clung to the skin. Soldiers huddled by campfires, holding out pieces of armor to the flames, only to feel the metal sear one side while the other stayed freezing. Knights on winter campaigns often faced a cruel paradox: strip the armor off and risk exposure to sudden attack, or keep it on and suffer the slow creep of numbness and frostbite. Chroniclers tell of fingers stiffening around sword hilts, of men unable to fasten their own straps come morning, their joints swollen and red from the freezing night. Even in tents, the cold was relentless. Blankets were thin, straw bedding offered little insulation from frozen ground, and armor laid beside a warrior would harden into a block of ice by dawn. Some men woke to find their gear rimmed with frost, straps stiff and brittle, forcing them to thaw their protection over fire before it could even be worn. Armor was built to withstand blows, not weather. Yet in the deep of winter, the two often felt the same. For those who shivered through such nights, the promise of dawn was less about battle and more about the relief of the sun's first warmth touching frozen steel. If winter punished warriors with cold steel, summer punished them with fire. To wear armor in the heat of summer was to step into a cage of smothering air, where sweat pooled and breath grew heavy, and even the strongest knight felt himself suffocate. Beneath his own protection, steel and iron did not merely sit in the sun, they absorbed it. A breastplate could grow hot enough to burn the skin beneath, while chainmail turned into a net of fire, each ring radiating heat into the gambeson below. Helmets were worst of all, trapping not only heat but stale breath, so that every exhale returned as a suffocating wave. The gambeson, that thick quilted layer meant for padding, became the soldier's tormentor in summer. It trapped sweat against the body, clung to the skin in sticky folds, and refused to dry by night. Once soaked, it smelled rank and bread sores, making rest nearly impossible. Nights offered little relief. In summer encampments, soldiers lay on the hard ground, the air heavy with dust and smoke from campfires. Armor set aside still radiated the day's heat, so that even resting beside it felt oppressive. Many men stripped down to their linen shirts when possible, desperate to feel air on their skin, yet always with the fear of a sudden alarm pulling them back into their hot, suffocating shells. Marches under the summer sun were ordeals in themselves. Chroniclers describe nights fainting on horseback, soldiers collapsing by the roadside, and camps reeking of sweat-soaked gambesons hung out to dry. Dehydration was a constant risk, and even water offered little relief when the body remained swaddled in layers of heat-trapping cloth and steel. For a warrior in summer, sleep was not rest but survival. A few hours of uneasy slumber, broken by thirst or the need to peel away sticky padding, might make the difference between enduring the next day's march or collapsing in armor too heavy to rise again. Armor was meant to shield men from enemies, but in the sweltering embrace of summer, it became the enemy itself, a silent, smothering foe, fought in every breath and every restless night. No terror haunted a medieval camp more than the threat of a night raid. Darkness was the ally of ambush. When soldiers were weary, weapons were set aside, and vigilance waned. To be struck in the depth of sleep was a warrior's nightmare, and so many chose the uneasy compromise of sleeping half-armored instead of donning the full weight. Men would keep on only the most vital pieces, a mail shirt or padded gambeson, a dagger tucked into the belt, sometimes a helmet kept close enough to snatch in the dark. A knight might lie down still wearing greaves on his shins, or keep his sword arm braced in vambraces, knowing that if danger came, those first blows could mean the difference between life and death. Chroniclers speak of armies startled awake by horns or screams, scrambling into formation in a blur of confusion. In such moments, there was no time for buckles and straps. Warriors lunged out of tents, barefoot, helms in hand, shields clutched to the chest, swords half-drawn. Some fought in little more than a sweat-soaked gambeson, others with breastplate on but bare legs, their vulnerability accepted as the price of speed. For commanders, the risk of a raid was ever present. Camps posted watches through the night, but discipline varied, and clever enemies struck at hours when drowsiness overcame the guard. Raiders aimed not only to kill, but to sow panic, stealing horses, setting fire to tents, cutting down those too slow to rise. In those frantic clashes, the camp itself became the battlefield. Fires lit shadows across terrified faces, armor clattered, as men stumbled into half-prepared battle lines, and sleep-fogged minds tried to sort friend from foe in the chaos. Victories and defeats alike were born in those midnight moments, where the weight of armor or its absence shaped fate. Sleeping half-dressed was not comfort, but it was survival. Every night, soldiers balanced exhaustion with readiness, lying down in uneasy truce with their own armor, praying that the night would pass without the horn's cruel call. For the medieval warrior, to remove one's armor was more than a practical task, it was a ritual of release. The act of unbuckling straps, loosening ties, and peeling away layers was the closest a soldier came to shedding the weight of war itself. The moment began slowly. A knight might lower himself onto a stool, exhausted, as his squire knelt at his side. Metal plates came off one by one, first the gauntlets that pinched the fingers, then the greaves from weary shins, the breastplate pried open like a caged chest. Each piece struck the ground with a heavy thud, the sound both final and comforting. For common soldiers, without the luxury of squires, the process was clumsier, done with tired hands fumbling at leather cords in firelight. But whether noble or footman, the sensation was the same: skin gasping for air, muscles sighing with release, the body rediscovering its own freedom. The gambeson, damp with sweat, was the hardest to remove. Soldiers peeled it away as if shedding a second, suffocating skin, steam rising in the cool night air. The stench of the day's labor was sharp, but even that was welcome. It was proof of survival. This ritual was more than physical. Soldiers often muttered prayers of thanks when their armor came off, whispering to saints or to God, grateful to have endured another day. Some kissed their swords before laying them beside their bedding. Others carefully stacked armor close at hand, unwilling to place too much trust in the darkness beyond the camp. The relief of removal was not just about comfort, but about identity. Beneath the steel, the warrior became a man again, sore, weary, human. For a brief span of night, he belonged not to the battlefield but to himself, to his dreams, and to the fragile hope of dawn. In the stillness of the camp, after armor was shed, silence deepened. The clatter of war faded into soft breathing, and the night embraced men who, for a few fleeting hours, were no longer soldiers bound in iron, but dreamers beneath the stars. Armor did not rest quietly after battle. Every clash, every march, every long day beneath the sun left its scars. Sweat soaked the padded gambeson, mud clung to mail links, and sometimes blood, one's own or an enemy's, smeared across polished steel. Before a warrior could truly sleep, the armor had to be cared for. For knights and nobles, this task often fell to squires. By firelight, young attendants worked patiently, wiping down breastplates with cloths dampened in water or vinegar, scraping mud from greaves, and oiling mail to ward off the creeping touch of rust. The steady rasp of cloth on steel became part of the nightly music of the camp, a soft, rhythmic sound beneath the crackle of the fires and the low murmur of voices. Common soldiers had no squires to aid them. They cleaned their gear with whatever was at hand: a strip of linen torn from old clothing, sand rubbed over stubborn grime, even tufts of straw. To leave armor untended was to invite weakness. Rust spread like disease, straps stiffened with sweat, and dried blood turned into a crust that ate into the very surface of steel. There was also a spiritual weight to the ritual. Some men wiped away blood with care, muttering prayers, as though cleansing not only their armor but their conscience. Others spat into the dirt as they worked, as if to cast away the memory of the day's violence. For all, the process was a reminder: armor was not immortal. It needed as much care as the body that bore it. In the silence after battle, warriors bent over their gear like monks at their scripture. Polishing was not vanity, it was survival. A neglected helm could mean poor vision tomorrow. A weakened male link could be the point where a blade found its way through. To clean armor was to prepare for the next dawn, the next fight, the next chance to live. And so, before heads touched straw, before dreams claimed the weary, there was always the quiet ritual of steel. Sweat, mud, and blood were scrubbed away, leaving the armor gleaming faintly in the firelight, ready to stand guard through the night beside its master. For every knight who stretched out on straw or beneath a canvas tent, there was often a boy, a squire, who did not sleep so easily. His duties extended beyond daylight battles and marches. The night too demanded his service. When the campfires burned low and the camp settled into uneasy quiet, squires moved silently among the shadows. Their first task was often armor, drying it near the fire so the damp did not creep into the steel, rubbing it down with oil to keep away the dreaded bloom of rust, and checking straps and buckles for wear. To a knight, armor was life itself. To a squire, armor was responsibility. Weapons, too, required attention. Blades dulled in combat were whetted anew. A nick in the edge was smoothed with patient strokes of a whetstone, the quiet rasp echoing faintly in the night. Sometimes squires bled from the work, small cuts across their fingers, but they pressed on. For a sword unready by morning was a shame that fell upon both master and servant. The duties went beyond steel. A squire fetched water for his knight, tended to the knight's horse, or prepared bandages for wounds. Some were tasked with holding vigil while their master slept, watching the entrance of the tent like a silent sentinel. Others woke before dawn, ensuring that armor could be donned swiftly at the first alarm. For young squires, these long hours were part of their training. They learned not only the handling of arms, but the endurance of service, the humility of unseen labor. Many dreamt of the day they would wear armor themselves, but until then, their nights were consumed by the needs of another. If the knight's removal of armor was a ritual of relief, the squire's tending of it was a ritual of loyalty. He worked while his master rested, sacrificing sleep for preparation, comfort for vigilance. In this way, the squire became the invisible backbone of the knight's survival, the unsung guardian of his master's rest. In the silence of the medieval camp, one could sometimes glimpse them, young figures bent over steel in the glow of dying firelight, keeping watch not only over weapons but over the fragile line between sleep and death. The medieval camp never truly slept. Even when silence fell and most warriors lay wrapped in cloaks, a soft rhythm continued in the shadows, the rasp of a whetstone against steel, the tug of needle and thread through leather. Swords, once wielded in the chaos of battle, rarely ended the day unscathed. Their edges bore tiny dents from clashing against other blades, their tips dulled from striking armor or shields. A knight or his squire could not afford to leave them so. The whetstone became as important as the sword itself, a small, rough companion carried everywhere. By firelight, its harsh whispers smoothed the scars of combat, drawing the edge back to deadly sharpness. Each stroke was not only maintenance but meditation, a ritual that tethered the warrior between the blood of the day and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Alongside the whetstone came the quieter, slower work of mending armor. Was a marvel of metal, but it depended on the hidden strength of straps and buckles. Leather stretched and cracked from sweat, rain, and strain. A broken strap could mean disaster in the next fight, leaving a breastplate hanging loose or a shield slipping from the arm. So men, and more often their squires, stitched by lamplight, patching torn leather, replacing rivets, and tightening buckles. For nobles, entire teams of squires and servants might labor late into the night, each one handling a different task, one with the sword, another with straps, a third with the polish. For the common soldier the work fell to his own hands, rough and hurried, yet no less vital. A bent nail hammered straight, a strap tied in a knot, instead of sewn, anything that kept the armor together. One more day, these small, weary acts of care were as much a part of warfare as the clash of battle. Without them, armor failed, weapons faltered, and men died. And so, in the dark hours before sleep, warriors and squires alike became craftsmen, sharpening, stitching, repairing, whispering their survival into steel and leather. By the time the camp finally quieted, the swords gleamed with fresh edges. The straps held firm once more, and the warriors lay down, knowing that if dawn brought blood, their tools would not betray them. When the camp sank into silence and only the faint crackle of dying fires remained, a softer light took over. Inside the tents of knights and nobles, oil lamps flickered gently, their golden flames bending shadows across canvas walls. In that glow, armor no longer looked like a weapon of war. It shimmered like a relic, half sacred, half human. Polished steel caught the lamplight in rippling reflections. A breastplate leaned against a wooden chest, glowing as though it held a fire of its own. A helmet rested on a stool, its open visor gazing into the dark like a watchful guardian. Even the simple curve of a gauntlet could shine like liquid silver when the light fell just so. Squires often polished armor in these hours, cloth in hand, rubbing away the day's grime, the rhythmic motion of the rag, the soft smell of oil, and the glow of the lamp gave the act a ritualistic calm. Each piece of steel transformed under touch, from battered and stained to luminous, smooth, almost untouchable. For some knights, this was a form of prayer as much as preparation, as if restoring armor to its shine restored a fragment of their own battered spirit. Yet the lamplight also revealed scars. Dents and scratches that no polish could erase stood out stark against the glow. Each mark was a memory of battle, a line in the armor's unspoken story. Some knights stared at these scars as they drifted into sleep, reminded of near escapes and the price already paid for survival. In these moments, the armor seemed more than metal. It became a silent companion, standing near the sleeping warrior, gleaming faintly in the dark. If the night brought danger, it would be there ready. If dawn came peacefully, it would be waiting, polished and loyal. Thus beneath the oil lamp's golden light, steel softened. It was no longer just iron and leather, but a reflection of the knight's life itself, harsh and scarred, yet still able to catch the glow of something gentle. In the stories told around hearths and later inked into books, knights gleam with impossible endurance. They are pictured riding through moonlit forests in full armor, sleeping beneath stars with steel still clinging to their shoulders, always ready to leap awake and fight for lady, lord, or king. The image is stirring and utterly misleading. The romantic vision comes from poets and chroniclers, not soldiers. Troubadours of the Middle Ages sang of knights who wore their armor as a second skin, their vigilance unbroken even in slumber. Later, Victorian illustrators and novelists polished this picture further, imagining gallant figures who never unbuckled their breastplates, whose devotion and strength eclipsed human frailty. The truth, however, was far less poetic. Armor was heavy, cumbersome, and suffocating. A man could fight in it for hours, endure it on campaign for days, but to attempt to sleep in it was punishment. The weight pressed down on shoulders and spine. The heat stifled, the straps cut into flesh. To lie all night encased in steel was to invite sores, illness, and sheer exhaustion. No seasoned warrior would have risked dulling his body so recklessly. Before another day's battle, when danger loomed, knights did sometimes rest in partial gear, perhaps keeping a gambeson or mail shirt on, or sleeping beside a helmet and breastplate for speed. But this was practicality, not romance. It was preparation for sudden attack, not a shining vigil of eternal chivalry. The myth endured because it served a purpose. It made knights appear superhuman, their devotion to duty stronger than fatigue, their steel inseparable from their souls. Such tales inspired audiences, flattered patrons, and fueled the dream of knighthood as a calling above mere mortal struggle. Yet in the soft darkness of real medieval camps, the truth was plainer. Armor lay in neat piles, glinting faintly by the fire, while its owner snored beneath blankets, every muscle aching for rest. Romance painted steel as a bedfellow. Reality left it at arm's reach. Across Europe, ballads and chronicles spun a vision of the knight that shimmered like gold leaf on a manuscript page. In these tales, warriors were giants of endurance, steel-clad, unyielding, and noble. They strode into battle, as if born for it, slept in armor, as if it were feather-light, and rose at dawn with hearts blazing for glory. Such stories were powerful. They reassured nobles who funded wars that their men fought not only with strength, but with poetry. They fed the dream of chivalry, that knighthood was a calling higher than hunger, fatigue, or fear. But beneath the banners and verses, the soldier's truth was harder. The epic was written in mud, sweat, and exhaustion. Knights did not gleam as they rode into camp. Their armor was dented, mud-caked, and heavy with sweat. They did not spend nights in vigil beneath the stars, but collapsed onto straw mats or bare ground, groaning with sore limbs. They did not rise effortlessly at dawn, but stiffly, joints creaking, squires tugging at straps to haul the weight back onto their shoulders. Armor was not a romantic cocoon, but a cage, necessary in battle, unbearable in rest, and unlike the tales, real campaigns were not endless duels of honor. They were days of hunger, trudging marches, and the constant dread of disease. For every knight's charge immortalized in a song, there were countless forgotten nights of blistered feet, aching backs, and desperate sleep snatched in between alarms. Yet the gap between tale and truth served its purpose. The myth gave meaning to the misery a soldier who suffered through rain and sleeplessness could imagine himself part of a grander story, a character in the same epic, sung by poets. In this way, the romance and the reality coexisted, one gilded, one raw, both shaping how knighthood was remembered. When we peel away the golden layers of legend, we see not tireless heroes in shining steel, but men, weary, sore, human, who laid their armor aside at night, not out of weakness, but out of sheer survival. When we picture Agincourt, Crecy, or Hastings, we often imagine armies that never truly rested. In the mind's eye, knights are already encased in steel as night falls, sleeping in their armor so that at dawn they can stride immediately into glory. But history tells us a different story, one where human bodies and practical needs shaped the hours before battle just as much as strategy and fate. On the eve of Hastings 1066, chroniclers wrote of Duke William's men gathered in prayer, not locked inside their mail hauberks. Armor was precious, and to wear it through the night risked exhaustion before combat even began. Instead, it lay stacked nearby, each man's kit guarded as closely as his weapon. Sleep came on hard earth, heads filled with dread of the fight to come. Before Agincourt 1415, the English army, starving, rain-soaked and weakened by dysentery, was in no state to spend the night imprisoned in plates. Their armor was readied, their weapons cleaned, but the men themselves needed every ounce of rest. Chroniclers note that Henry V's troops spent much of the night in prayer and confession, seeking divine strength for the day ahead. But when they lay down, it was not as iron statues, but as weary men who prayed for even a few moments of sleep. In siege warfare, however, the story could change. During long encampments around fortresses like Orleans or Acre, surprise night attacks were always possible. Soldiers might half-dress in their gear, sleeping with mail shirts on or helmets within arm's reach. Even then, few endured full suits of armor overnight. The body simply could not bear it. The image of warriors slumbering in steel survives because it dramatizes tension. The idea of men ready to leap into history at the break of dawn. But the reality was messier. Armor was near, swords were closer still, and sleep was fitful, but men stripped down because they had to. On the battlefield, fatigue could kill as swiftly as any blade. The great clashes of medieval history remind us that the night before a fight was not a tableau of knights asleep in glory, but of flesh and blood soldiers, desperate for rest, haunted by fear, and clinging to survival as dawn crept closer. The Middle Ages loved stories of impossible strength. Chroniclers, poets, and storytellers often told of warriors so hardened by war that they could wear their armor day and night, even in their sleep. These tales, embroidered with awe, helped shape the knightly ideal. But they also reveal how far legend could drift from lived experience. Some romances described knights who never parted from their harness, for fear of ambush or dishonor. A hero might be praised as ever watchful, lying down in steel as though it were silk. In Chanson's Digest, men like Roland or Ogier, the Dane, were depicted as so steadfast that no mortal discomfort could touch them. Their endurance became a metaphor for loyalty and unbreakable faith. Chivalric manuals, too, sometimes repeated such claims. Chroniclers eager to glorify their patrons would exaggerate, A noble might be praised for sleeping in arms before a great battle, suggesting a readiness so perfect it bordered on saintly. To later readers, this conjured an image of knights as tireless guardians, bodies of iron wrapped in spirits of fire. Yet, the reality lurked beneath. No human body could withstand a full night of steel and padding without suffering. The sores, sweat, and suffocation would debilitate even the strongest warrior by dawn. Such tales were never meant as literal truth. Instead, they were symbols. To sleep in armor was to embody vigilance, courage, and a heart always ready for combat. Interestingly, some frontier societies came closer to the legend. Border knights along the Spanish Reconquista or Crusaders in the Holy Land were sometimes described as keeping armor on for days during sieges or desert campaigns. But even here, the word sleeping armed usually meant a lighter state, keeping weapons at hand. Mail shirts partly on, or sleeping with helmets beside their heads. The legends of warriors who slept fully armed endure not because they describe fact, but because they express longing. A knight who never removed his harness was a dream of absolute readiness, an eternal sentinel against chaos. In the quiet of the camp, real soldiers stripped their burdens away. But in stories, they remained, forever clad in steel, guardians of ideals greater than themselves. For the medieval warrior, armor was more than a tool of survival. It was a sign, a visible language that spoke of watchfulness, duty, and readiness. To wear it, even in stillness, was to declare to the world, I am prepared. I will not be caught unguarded. Chroniclers often used armor to symbolize a knight's inner vigilance. A man who seemed never to remove his harness was praised not just for strength, but for constancy. Armor became a metaphor for the soul clothed in faith, the body clothed in duty. Religious writers sometimes drew parallels between steel armor and the armor of God, described in Scripture, a spiritual readiness that, like plate and mail, could never be set aside in castles and camps. The sight of a lord still half-armed, as he gave orders, inspired confidence. His armor spoke silently, a promise to his men that he would be ready at the first horn's call. Even when laid carefully beside the bedroll, its gleaming presence was enough to remind warriors of their obligations. The nearness of the harness became the nearness of discipline itself. This symbolism bled into literature and art. Illuminated manuscripts often showed knights perpetually in mail, their forms indistinguishable from their armor, as though flesh and steel had fused. Romances made sleeping in arms into a poetic shorthand for eternal watchfulness, the knight who does not rest, because his vow does not rest, of course. The truth was more practical. Armor was taken off each night, cleaned, inspected, and made ready again. But the myth endured because it carried a deeper meaning, that knights were not allowed the same rest as other men. Their lives were bound to a code of ceaseless vigilance, whether in prayer, in battle, or in the uneasy hours before dawn. Thus, armor was not only the burden of the body, but also the weight of expectation. To be armored always, in legend, if not in life, was to live as a sentinel of one's Lord, one's people, and one's God. Eternal vigilance, forged in iron, became the defining image of knighthood itself. No matter how many tales or romances painted knights as tireless warriors sleeping in steel, the blunt reality was this: Armor was built for combat, not for rest. Every part of a harness, the mail shirt, the breastplate, the gauntlets, was designed with movement in battle in mind. It was meant to deflect arrows, blunt sword cuts, and absorb the shock of lances. It was never meant to cushion a weary body against the ground. Sleeping in armor would be like trying to slumber inside a locked chest, rigid, stifling, and suffocating. Practical experience proved this to every soldier. After a march or a skirmish, the first relief was always the unbuckling of straps, the lifting away of iron plates, the peeling of sweat-soaked gambesons. It was not laziness, but necessity. Muscles ached, circulation slowed, and the body demanded release. To deny that release for long was to invite sores infection or collapse. That is why, even in the most dangerous of encampments, armor was almost always removed at night. Warriors might sleep in their clothes, with helmets and swords within arm's reach, but steel itself belonged to the battlefield. To treat armor as a second skin through every hour of day and night was to misunderstand its purpose. Armor was a tool, not a home. A shield against death, not a blanket for sleep. For all the poetry about knights who lived encased in steel, real men knew the truth. Armor was for battle, not for bed. For all the dangers that lurked in the medieval night raiders, assassins, sudden fires, there was one truth no warrior could escape. The body demanded rest. Fear might whisper that a man should remain armed and wakeful, but exhaustion shouted louder. After a day of marching in the sun, or clashing steel against steel in battle, the human frame reached its breaking point. Muscles trembled, wounds throbbed, and even the strongest knight could feel his eyelids grow heavy. Armor could keep a man alive in a fight, but in the stillness of the camp, it became a prison of fatigue, and so, more often than not, the warrior yielded. He unbuckled his breastplate, loosened the straps of his greaves, and allowed the cool air to touch his skin again. Fear was real, the fear of surprise attack, the fear of being caught unready, yet it could not rival the body's demand. For sleep, a man too tired to lift his sword was already defeated, armor or no armor. This is why camps relied on watches, sentries, and trusted companions. The burden of safety was shared, so that most could close their eyes, if only for a few hours. To fight day after day without sleep was impossible, and every commander knew it. Armor could guard a body from a blade, but only rest could restore the strength to lift that blade again. Thus, in the eternal balance between vigilance and exhaustion, it was rest that prevailed. The warrior's need for sleep, fragile, human, undeniable, always overrode fear. In the end, the reason most warriors dared to set aside their armor at night was not courage, but trust. No man could remain vigilant forever. To fight well, soldiers had to rest, and to rest, they had to believe that someone else was watching. This was the unspoken contract of the medieval camp. The knight trusted his squire to keep his harness in order, ready to be donned at a moment's notice. The common foot soldier trusted the sentries at the edge of camp, the men who walked the night with spear and torch. Companions trusted each other to stir, at the first cry of alarm, to stand shoulder to shoulder should danger come. Armor was heavy, stifling, and exhausting. But trust made it possible to set it aside. A soldier could lay down his breastplate because he knew a brother in arms kept the watch. A knight could slip off his gauntlets because he knew his lord's guards stood at the tent door. The bonds of fellowship, forged in battle and blood, created a kind of shield stronger than iron, the certainty that no man slept alone. This reliance on companions was not weakness, but wisdom. An army where every man tried to stand guard for himself would collapse from exhaustion. An army where men trusted each other to share the burden could march, fight, and endure. So in the quiet hours, when the armor rested by the bedside, it was trust in companions that allowed warriors to sleep unarmed, vulnerable, yet safer than if they had clung to iron all night. Stories of knights and warriors often celebrate their valor, their gallantry, their fearless charge into battle. But when the torches burned low and the din of combat faded, another truth pressed down heavier than any armor: exhaustion was stronger than bravery. A man could summon courage to face a spear, but he could not will his body to stay awake forever. Muscles shook from strain, wounds throbbed with pain, and even the fiercest heart slowed when the weight of fatigue bore down. To collapse in armor was no act of heroism. It was a failure to prepare for the next day's fight. Soldiers understood this deeply. Thus, the nightly ritual of laying down armor was not cowardice but survival. To surrender to rest was the bravest choice of all, an admission that strength had limits, that even the boldest warrior was, in the end, only human. This humanness was universal. It joined kings and peasants, knights and foot soldiers alike, in a shared need for sleep. The chronicles of war may sing of victories and valor, but beneath every tale lies an unspoken truth. Armies marched not on courage alone, but on weary bodies that demanded rest. Without sleep, bravery meant little. Exhaustion was the greater power, a force every man bowed to, no matter how bright his armor or how fierce his reputation.
When we imagine the medieval warrior, it is easy to picture him as a figure forever encased in steel, a tireless sentinel, unyielding and unbroken. But the truth, like the campfire shadows of history, is softer and more human. Armor was forged for battle, not for rest. By day, it turned flesh into iron, transforming men into living walls of defense and offense. But by night, it became a burden too heavy to bear. No warrior, no matter how noble or hardened, could endure the constant weight, the suffocating heat, the pressure on bone and breath. So each evening, in fields and fortresses alike, men set aside their iron shells. The clang of buckles undone, the hiss of mail drawn from the shoulders, the soft thud of a breastplate against the earth. These were the sounds of survival. Nearby, swords rested within reach. Armor lay close at hand, but the body was freed. In that freedom, they found the strength to rise again with the dawn. Steel by day, sleep by night.
The fire burns lower now, its light a gentle flicker against the steel resting on the ground. The camp, once alive with movement and murmurs, has settled into stillness. Only the crackle of embers and the distant hoot of an owl keep the night company. The warrior, who by day bore the crushing weight of armor and duty, lies at last in the fragile peace of sleep. His sword rests near, his armor close, but his body is free of its burden. Around him, companions breathe in unison, the rhythm of men surrendered not to fear, but to rest.